Right now, if your fridge is empty, you're 10 minutes from a solution. Delivery app, drive-through, a gas station on the corner. Even in the worst-case scenario, going a full day without eating meat barely registers as a hardship for you. But for hundreds of thousands of years, no meat wasn't an inconvenience. It was the default setting of being alive. Hunting fails. Most of the time, it fails. A group of skilled hunters throwing spears at animals faster and stronger than they are misses far more often than it hits. And when it does hit, that meat spoils in days without refrigeration. So the real question isn't what did ancient humans eat when they had meat? It's what did they eat during the weeks, sometimes months, when they didn't? And the answer to that question is the reason your species is still here. Let's start with a myth that needs to die. For most of the 20th century, the story of early humans was man the hunter. Spears, mammoths, campfires, meat. That was the image. But when anthropologists actually went out and studied hunter-gatherer societies still living traditionally in the 20th century, groups like the Kung San of the Kalahari Desert, they found something that broke the whole narrative. Meat made up less than a third of their diet, sometimes far less. The other two-thirds, sometimes closer to 80%, came from plants gathered mostly by women. Roots, nuts, berries, tubers, leaves. Gathering wasn't the backup plan. Gathering was the plan. Hunting was the bonus round. So when meat disappeared for weeks, life didn't stop. It just went back to what had been feeding people the whole time anyway.
The first fallback food, and probably the oldest one your ancestors ever relied on, was underground. Tubers, roots, bulbs, anything a plant stores its energy in beneath the soil, safe from animals, safe from weather, safe from other humans who can't see it. In 2010, archaeologists analyzing dental calculus, the hardened plaques scraped off ancient teeth, found microscopic starch granules trapped in the teeth of Neanderthals at a site in Iraq. Cooked starch, from plants like wild grains and root vegetables. This wasn't an occasional snack. It was baked into their bones, literally stuck between their teeth for over 40,000 years, waiting for someone with a microscope to find it. Digging up a root doesn't sound impressive, but think about what it actually requires. You need a sharpened digging stick, hardened in fire to keep the tip from splintering. You need to know the difference between a plant that will feed you and a nearly identical one that will kill you, because plenty of roots are toxic raw and only become edible after hours of processing. And you need memory, a map in your head of which patch of ground in which season hides food underneath it. That kind of knowledge doesn't come from one person. It gets built over generations and passed down, mother to daughter, group to group, for tens of thousands of years before anyone wrote anything down. Now here's where it gets stranger. When the tubers ran low too, when the whole landscape seemed to offer nothing, humans turned to something most of you would consider inedible. Insects.
Termite mounds, grubs pulled out of rotting logs, ant larvae, locusts during a swarm. To modern eyes, this looks like desperation food, but nutritionally, it's closer to a superfood. Termites alone can be nearly 40% protein and packed with fat, sometimes more calorie-dense gram for gram than beef. And unlike a fleeing antelope, a termite mound doesn't run away. It doesn't require a spear, a group of hunters, or hours of tracking. It requires a stick and a little patience. Some researchers now argue that insect gathering, not big game hunting, may have been one of the most reliable calorie sources for early hominins, especially in dry seasons when large animals scattered or migrated away entirely. There's evidence that early tool use, sharpened sticks worn down at a specific angle, may have first developed for digging into termite mounds, long before anyone sharpened a spear to bring down a mammoth. Coastal groups had a different fallback, and it might be one of the most important food sources in the history of your entire species: shellfish. At Pinnacle Point in South Africa, archaeologists found evidence that humans were harvesting mussels, whelks, and other shellfish from the shoreline roughly 164,000 years ago. That date matters. It's some of the earliest solid evidence of humans systematically eating seafood anywhere on Earth.
Shellfish don't run. They don't hide well. At low tide, they're just sitting there, attached to rocks waiting to be pried off. For a group facing weeks without meat, a rocky shoreline at low tide was closer to a grocery store than a wilderness. No weapon needed, no tracking skill required, just knowledge of the tide schedule and the willingness to get your hands wet. Some researchers believe coastal shellfish gathering may have been a critical survival strategy during a period when much of Africa's interior went through extreme drought, effectively acting as a lifeline that kept entire populations alive when inland food sources collapsed. If that's true, the humble mussel might be one of the reasons your ancestors survived a bottleneck that nearly wiped out the species entirely. Then there's the food source that required no digging, no hunting, no waiting for a tide. It was already there, hanging in plain sight. Nuts! In the Kalahari, the mongongo nut has been documented as one of the single most important calorie sources for the Kung San, so dense in fat and protein that researchers calculated a person could meet their entire daily caloric needs from mongongo nuts alone, with effort left over. And they're not seasonal in the way fruit is. A mongongo tree can drop nuts that stay viable on the ground for close to a year, meaning stored nature, food nature already packaged and preserved without anyone lifting a finger.
Other regions had their own versions. Acorns in parts of North America and the Mediterranean required serious processing, pounding, leaching out bitter tannins with repeated soaking in water, but once processed, they stored for months. Pine nuts, walnuts, pistachios, and wild form across Eurasia. Wherever humans went, they learned which tree in that specific landscape was going to save their lives when the animals disappeared. Now here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. Fallback foods weren't just about calories. They were about knowledge as insurance. A group that only knew how to hunt was one bad season away from starvation. A group that knew 40 different edible plants, which parts were poisonous raw, which needed boiling, which season each one appeared in, that group had a safety net that hunting alone could never provide. This is why anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherers found something remarkable. The oldest members of these groups, the ones who could no longer hunt effectively, were often the most valuable people in the entire band. Not because of strength, because of memory. They knew where the emergency food was, decades of seasons stored in their heads, information a young hunter simply hadn't lived long enough to accumulate yet. Losing an elder wasn't just an emotional loss, it could be a survival risk. There's also the question of what happens to the body itself during weeks without protein-rich meat. Skeletal evidence from ancient populations shows something called Harris lines, faint markings in bone that form when growth is interrupted by periods of malnutrition, then resumes once food returns. Archaeologists have found these lines in remains going back tens of thousands of years, physical proof written directly into the skeleton that lean periods, weeks of scarce or low-quality food, weren't rare emergencies. They were a regular part of the yearly cycle for huge portions of human history.
And yet, population survived, generation after generation. That survival wasn't luck. It was strategy stacked on strategy. Digging sticks for roots, knowledge of which insects were safe and abundant, timing shoreline visits to the tide, storing nuts that stayed edible for months. None of these things individually would have been enough. Together, they built a diet resilient enough to survive droughts, failed hunts, and entire seasons where the animals simply weren't there. There's a case from a completely different environment that shows just how far this adaptability could stretch. Arctic groups, living in landscapes with almost no plant life for most of the year, developed the opposite emergency system. When meat and fat ran low, they relied on stored fermented foods, buried fish and meat left to break down slowly in the cold, a preservation method that let a single good hunting season stretch across an entire winter of scarcity. Different environment, same underlying principle. Never depend on a single food source, because any single source can vanish. So when you picture ancient humans starving without meat, the picture is wrong. Meat was never guaranteed. It was the unreliable, occasional bonus in a diet primarily built on things that didn't run, didn't hide, and didn't require a spear at all. Roots pulled from the dirt, termites pulled from a mound, shellfish pried from a rock, nuts picked up off the ground, already fallen, already waiting. Here's the full picture. Long before your ancestors were reliable hunters, they were expert generalists. People who knew 40 different backup plans for a landscape that offered no guarantees. Weeks without meat weren't a crisis that threatened extinction. They were a Tuesday, a predictable part of the year that an entire body of inherited knowledge existed to survive. Every time you complain about an empty fridge, remember that somewhere in your ancestry, someone spent an entire lifetime memorizing which roots wouldn't kill them, which insects were safe to eat raw, and exactly which low tide to visit for dinner. That knowledge fed a species for hundreds of thousands of years. You're only here because none of it was ever forgotten in time.